Okay, well now I'm trying to remember if we finished off this section last week or if we just got into it. We might have, no one can remember. I'm just not sure. Well, we'll go through it quickly. We're gearing down now. We only have a few more questions in the Song of Solomon. If we finish early today, well, that's all right. I didn't start Isaiah yet. I had the Wednesday night class, so I worked on that lesson yesterday instead of moving into Isaiah. But we'll look at a question asked, how does the book emphasize the intensity of the love between Solomon and the Shulamite? And Solomon 6, verses 4 and 5. And Naomi, if you get that, do you want to read that, please?
You are beautiful as trees of my love, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners. Turn away your eyes from me, for they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of goats, leaping down the slopes of Gilead.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. Is there any thoughts in there that, any statements in there that Solomon makes that you might tie in with this thought of the intensity of the love, the genuineness of the love in these verses? He uses the thoughts of two cities. And a city, I guess, in those days, we think of a city, we don't really think of maybe security, do we, in our cities? I was thinking as we were driving down this morning, I think more of our house. What thoughts does our house bring to our minds? It brings security, you know, you go within, step in your door, you close your door behind you, you're in your home. The world is locked out. And in those days, the idea of the cities, they were always walled, so intruders couldn't get in. There was the thoughts of protection. Usually the cities you would think of, if you're a city person, then the buildings and the city around you is beauty to you. And it seems that Solomon is thinking of this idea of pleasantness of his beloved, the happy relationship that they have together. And Jerusalem, he also ties in that they're lovely as Jerusalem. Again, the thoughts of the beauty of that city. Solomon built most of that, beautified it, and it was the beauty of these two cities that kind of represented his feelings for her. And then chapter 8 and verse 6. I don't know if anyone else had any other thoughts on that. Maybe the thought of the army with its banners. You know, a banner is something, if you're in the army, you march under that banner. That banner represents who you are, who you belong to, who you're fighting for. It kind of paints a picture of charm. To those that are in the military, banners would be a form of charm to them. And when we see it, it's again the thoughts of protection, maybe peace also flying under that. We can tie that in with later in another question here, thinking of Jeff?
I was thinking that we might not be able to relate
right
to those particular things because we haven't seen how beautiful these things or wonderful they are. But what we do recognize is the passion that Solomon writes these words. You know, just because we may not be able to compare our life with someone else's, we can recognize passion in someone's writing.
Right, exactly. Sometimes in our fast-paced world, we don't consider things, you know. It's kind of maybe why I appreciate camping and something, and being in the kayaks, you're out on the water, there's nothing around, there's no noise. It's just it's almost the peacefulness is almost hurts your ears. It's pressure on them, but it gives you time to get your thoughts away from your daily lives and think upon what's around you, think upon the blessings in your life. But you're right, it's the same idea here with Solomon, because he lived there in those times. Like we had mentioned a couple of weeks ago, your hair is like a flock of goats. To us, that means nothing. Most of us aren't sheep herders and farmers anymore. But in those days, goat skins, sheep skins, that was pretty valuable stuff. Used for clothing and the beauty of them. But like you say, sometimes we lose track of that in our lives. But chapter 8 and verse 6, Lisa, do you want to read that, please? Song of Solomon, chapter 8 and verse 6. Okay. A seal, set me as a seal upon your heart, a seal upon your arm. What is a seal in those days? What was a seal? Who usually used them? Mostly. Kings. Right, Jeff? Whenever a letter was sent, a king would put his seal on it. We was watching some Disney movie last night. I forget what it was now, but someone wrote a letter, and then they put that wax on the letter and put their stamp, their seal on the letter, and then that was an insignia that whoever received that letter knew this was from the king. It was a sign of ownership, and were compared. The Shulamite now is speaking, the bride, to Solomon, and she's telling him, set me as a seal upon your heart. Thoughts of I belong to you, and no one else. And then, for love is as strong as death. Death can't be escaped, can it? Death is going to happen to all of us. And her love is as strong as that. It can't be changed. It can't be escaped. Her love for him has seized her, we could say, with a powerful force. We've all experienced that. And it seems she'll not rest until she is under his power. She's giving herself and her all to him. And then I'm sure we understand the last sentence in that verse, jealousy. We all understand jealousy, don't we? Doesn't matter what time or age we live in. Jealousy is used here as another term for love, which she's saying it can never be yielded or shared. Her love for him can't be escaped. She considers him her possession. And those are powerful thoughts, compared to sometimes what the world speaks of as far as love goes. It's, who you love today. That can be gone. Well, we'll love someone tomorrow, someone new. That is not how we are to view love. And then verse 7 of chapter 8. Sandra, do you want to read that, please?
Any waters do not quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man would give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be contempt.
Okay. Again, the thoughts of many waters can't quench love. We've all experienced downpours where totally everything gets drenched. But that has no effect. That would have no effect on her love. Nor can the floods drown it. Floods would destroy everything, don't they? But what is it about love? I guess try and get you to think. Well, maybe I just give you what my answer was. Doesn't love overlook all calamities, all problems? You know, sometimes you see that on the news, or even you witness that amongst friends that maybe lose everything. And usually, what is the first thing they say when they really consider what's happened, what's around them, is, that doesn't matter. I'm still living. I still have my wife and children. You know, that's the power of love. It just overlooks all those things. And also, the thought of all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly despised. We all understand money can't buy love, can it? You know, there's many that try that, but it can't be purchased, can it? It's God hasn't made us that way. He's made us emotional people. And when we understand love, as we see here in Song of Solomon, between husband and wife, then we're moved to a higher level. You know what I mean? It's not something that we can purchase or buy. And God intended that husband and wife enjoy the riches and blessings of their union as one. And He's shown us how to accomplish that in the Song of Solomon here. And you know, it's we rightly say too, it's not easy. So many times we fall into grumpy traps and selfish traps. But if we concentrate, if we think about what God has intended for us and see the joys of it, then we overcome those problems. And so we'll move on. If anyone has any comments. Now I forget now how to move this up. Is that it? Or did we go down? We went down. There we go. So next in the content of Song of Solomon, it illustrates God's love for his people. Remember, in the beginning we talked about what the different thoughts were of the Song of Solomon. And we agreed, and I believe, that it is exactly what it's portraying. It's a love story. It's a song. It's a poem that Solomon wrote to his bride, and his bride in reply or replies to him in her thoughts. But we did say that it does illustrate. We can see things in the scriptures that draw us back to God and Christ. And Dave asked us, in what ways does the love between Solomon and his Shulamite bride illustrate the spiritual love that the Lord has for his people? And think about it. Throughout this book, we find expressions of love and devotion. Although, like Jeff said, they're from different lifestyles and traditions of the past, but we still understand and see the bonds of courtship. Remember those days of dating, the joys of that, and then the marital bliss. And thinking upon them, we are moved to consider true biblical love as intended by God for for husband and wife. And as we meditate upon this, so we begin to see an even greater example of true love, don't we? And that is the love that's extended to man by his Creator. You know, thinking of Jeff in his opening prayer, we are a blessed people. We don't deserve what we have been given. We didn't even want it in the beginning. And yet God loved us so much, you know, that he was willing to do everything possible to draw us back, to have us think upon his goodness and bring us back. And he continues to offer an open invitation. As Jeff said, you know, each morning the sun comes up and we wake up and realize that we have another day. There's hope for family, there's hope for friends, there's hope for ourselves to overcome, sin that still tries to ensnare us and enslave us. And that invitation is God calling us back to his loving side. But of course, we always need to beware that when Christ comes again, that invitation will have expired. But if you look at Hosea 2, we'll look at Hosea chapter 2. And we'll... that's a passage... Hosea chapter 2. Maybe we'll take a verse each and we'll read from 14 to 20. Yes, Hosea 2, verses 14 to 20. And I guess we're at you, Henry. We'll start with you, please. Hosea chapter 2, verse 14. The which? 2. Oh, okay, if you want to take 2, sure.
Therefore, behold, we are a miracle. We are bring her into the wilderness and speak comfort. And we are given her vineyard from the valley of the amber as before. She shall sing there as in the days of praise, and in the days when she came up from the land of Israel.
Okay, thank you. In that passage, what do we see there? Who is speaking there?
God.
Right, Jeff. And who's he speaking to? Verse 14 kind of lets us. Who's he? Is he speaking to the Gentiles?
His people.
Right, Jeff. He's speaking to his people. And he's letting them know Remember at the beginning of Hosea, Hosea really speaks to them of God's wrath, of their sins. But now we see here that God is pleading with them and reminding them. He says there, "Behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her." I think there of Egypt, he's taking them away from the idols, all the sinfulness that is alluring them in Egypt. He's going to take them away from that. I'm going to allure you away from that by offering them mercies and looking after them and taking them into the wilderness. And really in the wilderness, then they're away from all that sinful enticements, aren't they? They can't see it. And that's a blessing in itself. If you want to get away from things that attack you sinfully, get away from it. Don't allow even your eyes to witness it. And then God says, "And speak comfortably unto her." He wants to entice them back to Him. He loves them that much, even though they've turned their backs upon Him. And then in verse 15, we see that He'll restore back to them what He had to take from them because of sin. God takes things away from us because of our sin. And Israel, you think of Israel learned through the sins of Achan to stand in awe of God. As I thought about that, he says that and the valley of Achan for a door of hope. Sometimes maybe, we need to go back in our minds to those days of sin and our rejection of God. And then look ahead. Don't stay there because we'll be overcome by that. But look ahead of that and see what God is offering us. See how He's drawing us to His side. And that's what He's asking them. And then in verse 16 we see the blessing that's kind of been given to us also. We're able to call God our Father now. That's pretty wonderful. And there He's telling them that they can put Baal, the idols, behind them, and He can call Jehovah, Israel can call Jehovah their husband. Those are pretty powerful blessings and thoughts. And by them calling God husband, by them drawing their minds continually to that thought, then they will put the thoughts of Baal behind them. The idols in Egypt that were so fluent in front of them. They'll forget about them. They'll be gone. And then we see in verse 18, He makes a covenant with them, brings them back into the land. Remember, the land had laid waste in the years of captivity. And beasts and animals would have had free range of that country. And God says that He'll protect the land from the damaging conditions of that. And also the thought of Israel wasn't going to have to go back to war to reclaim that land. God's giving them everything. And then in verse 19 we have again the thoughts of a marriage relationship. Because God says, "I will betroth thee unto me." That's the thought again here of husband and wife. The husband, "I want you for my wife." And God is saying that to them, to Israel. "I'll betroth you back. I want you back. Even though you've turned your backs upon me and sinned and fallen away, I want you back, and I will bless you righteously. I will show loving kindness and mercy to you." That's amazing. That's, keep going back to Jeff's prayer here this morning, but I think of that with us. What has God given to us? He's betrothed us through Christ. He's reached out to us. Those are thoughts that we need to continually remember. And then verse 20, God reminds us, Israel, that He will be constant and He will be faithful to them. And that's a thought that is kind of distorted in our day, really, isn't it? Faithfulness isn't kind of a word that, and thoughts that are used very much. But we just see God's amazing love is depicted there, and His love for us, as we've said, because we're the spiritual Israel now. And it's even kind of more awe-inspiring when we think about it, because through Jesus Christ, who manifested the highest form of showing of love at Calvary, it's through that God has these feelings towards us. I think Ephesians 5 verses 25 to 27. Tim, maybe I'll get you to read that quickly to remind us. Ephesians 5 verse 25 to 27.
Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish.
Okay. As we've been studying Song of Solomon, now we read this verse. It's kind of a little different outlook on it, isn't it? We love our wives and thinking of Christ. It's a sacrificial love, isn't it? It's a love that takes us, I guess, to the peak of understanding, having an understanding for someone else, and the idea of the love that Christ had for us. He's done everything for us and continues to do everything for us. As we've seen, the love between Solomon and his bride, it thrived. The only reason it reaches the peak that we read of is because of loyalty and faithfulness for one another. There's no other way that it can reach that form unless that's there. And so the love of Christ, as we think about it, is an even greater form of love that demands loyalty and faithfulness from us who constitute His bride. 2 Corinthians 11:2 reminds us of that. Jeff, maybe I'll get you to read that, please.
For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, amazing, eh? That a godly jealousy takes us to a different level, doesn't it? And the thought that we're betrothed to Christ, when in the beginning we had no desire to even understand. Jeff?
Also, we see in the Song of Solomon that sort of the completion of love and the fulfillment of love, that it takes two people like Solomon and Shulamite bride and brings them together. You can see in their language how they grow together and they become one together. Like
right.
God said from the beginning, that man and woman shall be joined together and two shall become one. And Jesus said in a very similar way in John chapter 17 in his prayer to his Father. In John 17:20 and 21, he said, I do not pray for these alone, but also to those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. And in verse 23, I and them and you and me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. So with Solomon and his bride, we see that same thing in love, uniting together to become one.
Right, right. And that's a good passage. We see that too, don't we, with Christ and with us. Helps us understand how we can reach perfection as much as we can possibly do that, because we do fail. We fail so many times, but when we think of it that way and keep building our strength, it becomes it becomes, I don't know what the word is, non-thinkable. We don't even think. We just automatically do it and respect Christ for what he has done for us. And so then we move on to the last section of our content of Song of Solomon. And we're asked the question, how does Song of Solomon rebuke the practice of polygamy? Solomon chapter 6. Solomon chapter 6, verses 8 and 9. Do you want to read that, Mom? Please? Chapter
6, 8 and 9.
Yeah.
Knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death no longer has dominion over it.
6, chapter 6.
Song of Solomon.
Oh yeah, where was Mom was back in John. Sorry, I guess I didn't say that.
Just Romans.
Oh, okay. No, Song of Solomon, chapter 6. That's all right. Mom, I think it was this word that I couldn't pronounce last week, wasn't it? Polygamy.
There are 60 queens and 80 concubines, and virgins without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, the favorite of the one before her. The daughter saw her and called her blessed. The queens of the concubines, and they praised her.
Okay, thanks, Mom. Remember, polygamy defined as the state or practice of having more than one wife or one husband at a time. It is, as we have clearly seen so far in our study, a deviation, isn't it, from the plan of marriage that God ordained. Remember, we read back in Genesis 2 and Matthew 19, 1 Corinthians 7. It is not what God intended. Those passages make it plain as day. But throughout the whole, you tell me, how do you think the Song of Solomon rebukes the practice, just with those verses that Mom read? What do we see there? He's comparing his bride, isn't he, to what? What's he comparing her to? In the very beginning of verse 8. What's he comparing her to? What's he seeing there? Right, Henry. With 60 queens and 80 concubines that he's thinking of, and virgins without number. And then he says, my dove, as he spoke of her that way throughout the book, my perfect, what's the next word? What's the next word after perfect? Right. Right there. My perfect one is the only one. The only one of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. The daughter saw her and called her blessed. Throughout this whole book, and we're given a few verses there, but I'm going to try and get through this. We see the monogamous thought here. It's only one. And it's exactly, in this book, it's exactly as God intended, isn't it? His desire for man and woman to enjoy a rich and fulfilling relationship is shown throughout the book. And it's always one, isn't it? Love for. Now, having said that, when we think of Solomon, we're asked, why is it ironic that Solomon wrote the story presented in the Song of Solomon? Why do you think it's ironic? I'm sure this thought must have come to you in our study so far. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 to 3. Remember this from when we were studying overview of Kings, didn't we? 1 Kings 11, verse 1. Naomi, do you want to read that, please?
Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women.
Verse 2 reads, From the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And verse 3, And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And the result, his wives turned away his heart. It's pretty amazing. There's multiple theories on when Solomon wrote this love song. Was it in his youth? When he was filled with godly, righteous wisdom? Or was it his middle age? Or was it when he was growing old and reflecting back? We're not told, are we, when he wrote this. But we do wonder, don't we, how a king who was notorious for living a polygamous life, how could he have ever began or seen the joys of one man and one wife? But obviously, at whatever point of his life, he wrote this, obviously through the charm and the inward beauty of this Shulamite maiden. As Dave says, Solomon was led, at least temporarily, to regard the beauty of God's plan for marriage, and thus delivering a pretty stern rebuke towards polygamy, doesn't it? And we also really see the immense power of Satan and unbridled lust in that a man such as Solomon, who was known for his great wisdom, lost not only his kingdom, remember, and soul, but he also lost what God had intended for him to enjoy here upon earth as far as the marriage relationship goes. But through the book, reading it and taking what he says through that book, we see the pureness, don't we? And the joy of what God intended. And we can't maybe laugh and disregard Solomon too much, because we've all the blessings from God we've learned sometimes and understood those blessings too late. You know, there's always consequences from sin. But clearly, God intended for us to, through Solomon's song to his Shulamite bride, God intended that we see exactly what he wants for husband and for wife. I don't know if there's any other thoughts, Jeff?
I guess we have to remember that he was blessed with godly wisdom.
Right.
But he clearly didn't always choose to humbly follow that wisdom that he was blessed with. It's one thing to have it, it's another thing to follow it.
I know. I thought that maybe he had wrote this in his youth. We don't know. But you're right. That thought crossed my mind. And which I took that thought and brought it over to my side of my life. We know what God has. We can barely imagine what eternity will be like and what God has offered us, but we know he's offering that glory to us and that he's faithful. He's going to do that if we are faithful to him. And Jeff makes up a good point, you know. Sometimes we have the wisdom to see and understand, and yet then when Satan comes upon us, we turn our backs upon it. And so there's the outline then. We made it through. We're a couple minutes over, but we saw through the book then the mutual affection of Solomon and the Shulamite. And then moving on from there, we saw the longing of Solomon and the Shulamite. They longed for each other. Then the marriage ceremony. And then we read of the absence of Solomon and how his bride considered him and the thoughts of him. And then the end of the book, chapter 8, then we see the nature of true love. And so we made it through the book, and I think if one thing we've learned is that there's areas that we can work upon. Those of us that are husband and wife, and for those I was thinking yesterday, well, what have we lent to those that have not got a husband or wife yet? Well, what I could come up with in my thoughts was that consider what God wants from you and wants you to do in your relationship. Consider that before you make that commitment. There's a beauty, you see the beauty of it, but we'll also need to think about the responsibility of it and consider those thoughts before the commitment is made. So we'll end there. And next week we'll begin, I'd said last week in Jeremiah, I forgot Isaiah's before Jeremiah. So we'll begin with Isaiah next week then.